Thank you for attending today's session. We will be getting started in just a few minutes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's session of the APA and New York Planning Federation Conference. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Okay. All right. Thank you for attending today's session, the scenario planning to increase community resilience of the 2021 Joint Planning Conference of the New York Upstate Chapter of the American Planning Association and the New York Planning Federation. My name is Samantha Aldrich. And before we get started, I would like to thank our conference premier sponsor, Hodgson and Russ, and the sponsor for this session, Bergman. Without our partners, this virtual conference would not be possible. We want to let you know that all of our sessions are being recorded and will be available online through the conference page and the New York Upstate Chapter's YouTube channel. Links will be provided on the Eventbrite event page as videos become available and are posted. All attendees are automatically muted. If you do have any questions, you can feel free to submit them in the Q&A box, and we will address questions actually during the entire session, so feel free to admit them as the session unfolds. We are providing the session CM credit number, which is CM9221258, and I will provide that in the chat box. And the information is also available on the Eventbrite page and the APA website as well. And for attendees seeking planning and zoning board credit, you will receive an email confirming your attendance and the session's eligibility for planning and zoning board member training credits approximately 24 hours after this event. Viewing webinar recordings are also eligible for CM credits and may be eligible for planning and zoning board member credit. Planning and zoning board members should check with their respective municipalities to confirm eligibility. Our session today does feature 3 speakers that we have here on the call. The first one is Elizabeth King. And Liz is an urban planner and landscape architect with Bergman. She holds graduate degrees in biology and landscape architecture. And Liz approaches projects from an interdisciplinary perspective and has built her career in the public sector, working on a broad range of projects from offshore wind planning in the Atlantic Ocean to community-based planning efforts across upstate New York and the Northeast. We also have Jamie Thoman, and Jamie is a senior project manager at Bergman as well, and she has nearly 2 decades of experience in land use and environmental planning, specializing in water resources. Her expertise in flood resilience and in programs such as the National Flood Insurance Program and Community Rating System is recognized across New York State. And she also currently participates in the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel of the Climate Action Council. And lastly, we also have Mary Osterman. And Mary is the Great Lakes Coastal Community Development Specialist and Great Lakes Regional Lead for New York Sea Grant and Cornell University. Her primary expertise is in community resilience with 2 principal focus areas, climate adaptation and floodplain management. Her additional experience includes watercraft inspection, local government training, process facilitation, and collaborative network building. And at this point, I will now turn the presentation over to the speakers.
Great, thanks, Sam. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. And hopefully you all can see the presentation. So as Sam mentioned, our presentation and really exercise for today, training exercise for today is scenario planning to increase community resilience. Here's us, your 3 speakers that Sam just introduced. Thanks, Sam. And before we really jump into it, I kind of just wanted to give you a preview for what this session entails for you all as participants. So we're going to give you a quick intro, kind of crash course to resilience and scenario planning. And then follow that up with a couple case studies just to give you some ideas for how scenario planning can be applied in community planning context and how scenario planning can help you to increase your community resilience. And then we're going to spend really the bulk of this section doing some scenario planning in breakout groups. So for close to 45 minutes, you'll be put into breakout groups working through a scenario planning activity where you're building your own scenarios and working through a series of different questions. And then we'll all come back together for the last 15 minutes and share some lesson learned, what worked, what didn't work, and how you see these tools that we've introduced being applicable to your job and your work and your professional career. So first, resilience and scenario planning. And we just wanted to provide a definition for what resilience is. And resilience is really the capacity of a system, a social and ecological system, to absorb or withstand disturbances and other stressors and still maintain its basic structure and function. So really, when we think about resilience, we often think about the idea of a rubber band or flexibility and being able to kind of snap back. So when you have a big storm or you have a natural disaster, how does your community respond during that event and then recover so that you can still continue to provide the services and the quality of life that really defines your community? So resilience is often talked about and is also related to several other community and planning initiatives. It's related to hazard mitigation planning, which many of your communities have potentially a hazard mitigation plan. It's also related to the larger idea of sustainability. All 3 of these concepts are proactive in nature. So looking forward to understand what your community's vulnerabilities potentially are and what actions you could take to reduce those vulnerabilities to different stressors or disturbances. And also these 3 concepts, the larger goal being that a community is able to sustain and improve the quality of life for its residents. Some of the kind of differentiating features of resilience in particular is that resilience really focuses on adaptation, learning from events, and making changes to essentially improve your ability to respond in the future, as well as capacity building. So making sure that your community at multiple different scales has the capacity to respond appropriately, quickly, and quickly recover from some kind of disturbance. One of the first steps in understanding resilience and kind of tackling resilience is understanding what are you trying to build resilience to, and for what are you trying to build resilience. So for the purpose of this training, we are talking about the resilience of a community to climate change and climate stressors. We're going to highlight throughout this presentation a couple of key terms that are going to show up in the exercise and the activity, and just some of the climate stressors that we in upstate New York are starting to experience as a result of climate change are coastal storms, drought, sea level rise, flooding, and extreme precipitation. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the stressors that you're going to see reemerge in the activity once we move into that. And then another really important step as your community kind of tackles resilience is really understanding where you are in relation to other systems. So if you're thinking about social and political scales, and in this example, if we were Albany County, Albany County is working within the larger context of New York State, United States, and the global environment as a whole. Some of the larger scales are really kind of these controlling variables that are passing legislation, passing policy that are kind of controlling and defining some of the actions and the context within which the county operates. But then there are also smaller scales that are operating much faster within the county. So thinking about municipalities with their own ordinances, their own local laws, as well as landowners who are daily managing and changing the environment. So really, as you're thinking about resilience, you really need to understand kind of where you are and what other scales or other social political contexts are related to you, how you as a community are impacting those scales and how they impact you as well. And then there's not only the social political scales, but also the natural scales. So really understanding kind of where you're situated and keeping the example of Albany County. Albany County is really defined by two major water bodies, the Mohawk River and the Hudson River, which have huge watersheds. And so a lot of actions that are taken within the watershed directly impact water quality and conditions within Albany County. And then also the actions that Albany County takes can affect communities downstream as well as upstream. And then as you see to the graphic on the right, natural boundaries don't follow political boundaries. So there's also kind of the added challenge of really understanding both your social political context, but also your natural context and how actions that your community is taking has impacts across all of those scales. And then to add another layer of complexity, your community is built on a series of different sectors and is defined by a series of different systems. So when we're thinking about resilience, we really can't approach it from kind of a siloed approach. It has to be an approach to where we're looking at, if we make a change to our infrastructure, for example, what are the cascading and potentially unintended consequences that those actions might have on health and social systems, on housing, on cultural systems, on natural systems. So again, when we're thinking about resilience, there's a lot of other factors that we have to consider, specifically to in regards to how our actions as a community are kind of affecting other systems as well as systems across different scales. I think, the biggest point I want to make here is that resilience, and we're talking about resilience to climate change in this session, both of those are huge topics. They're both complex. And sometimes it's really hard to wrap your head around, where do we even begin when you start to tackle this complexity? And that's where scenario planning really comes in as a useful planning tool to help us both manage and understand this complexity. So some of the major benefits of scenario planning, and we hope you kind of realize this throughout the activity in the session, is that scenario planning allows you to break down complex topics into really manageable pieces. You can explore different scenarios to start to understand what are the different to understand things that are very uncertain, for example, climate change, where we don't know how hot it's going to get, how much rain we're going to get. So by exploring different futures and kind of creating different scenarios, we can start to think about, well, if we get a little bit of rain, how would we respond? How would we then respond if there was a lot of rain in a given event? Scenarios also allow us to start to explore how our actions have effects on other systems and if there are unintended consequences, how we can adjust and refine our actions to really build resilience across all systems that define our community. And scenario planning also, because we're generating these hypothetical situations, it starts to remove some of the emotion and bias and allows for candid conversation and discussion around an issue. And there's no really right or wrong issue. The sky is the limit in scenario planning. So it becomes this tool to help us really manage complexity. So today, the purpose of this training really is to give you a tool that you can start to integrate into your own work. And we hope that you walk away with this, seeing the possibilities in your own professional world. We'll be talking about, and that tool will help you walk through, how do you as a community respond to different climate stressors? What are the impacts that those climate stressors are going to have on different systems, from housing to infrastructure to cultural assets? And what are some of the different strategies or projects that you could implement to really mitigate the effects of those impacts? And then let's take a look at those strategies. And if they were implemented, what are maybe some of the cascading consequences to other systems? And how would you maybe go back and revise those to make them more resilient across all sectors within your community? So now I'm going to pass it off to Jamie, and she's going to give you some real world examples to kind of take some of these hypothetical concepts and really apply them to your own community.
Great. Thank you, Liz. Thumbs up if everyone can hear me okay. Perfect. Okay. So again, yes, hi, welcome everyone. My name is Jamie, and I'm going to walk you through what I'm calling a climate scenario story. So as we have been mentioning in our presentation, at some point we are going to break into our groups and do some interactive activities and some small group work using a few different tools. So before we get there, we just wanted to kind of walk through this climate scenario story with you and get you more familiar with what we're asking everyone to do here today, and more familiar with some of the terminology. So first, we're going to walk you through, using this diagram, what we mean by these different steps. So the first is talking about, again, this particular scenario is discussing climate adaptation, resilience, and mitigation. So what is the climate stressor? So in the particular story that I'm going to tell, I'm going to walk through the story of Superstorm Sandy. I think it's something that we're all pretty familiar with. And so we're going to identify our climate stressor, thinking in particular about Superstorm Sandy. And that was a very major, intense coastal storm. So that is going to be our climate stressor for this particular scenario story, a coastal storm. And the environment in which we're going to look at is thinking about the development. We're going to have a suburban area, and our environment is going to be a tidal coast. So thinking of our community and the climate stressor. So moving forward into step 2. So we're going to think about our superstorm and the impact that this severe coastal storm is going to have on our tidal coast suburban community. And we're going to think about those impacts looking at these particular support functions. Now, these 6 support functions are defined through FEMA's National Disaster Recovery Framework. They're called core recovery functions, and they are basically descriptive of the health, social, economic, natural, and environmental fabric of the community. So I'm going to talk about the climate stressor and the impact that our coastal storm is going to have on one particular core recovery function. And you will also choose this core recovery function when you go into your breakout rooms. I'm going to talk about housing. So now I'm going to think about this coastal storm and the impact that it's going to have on my suburban tidal coast environment and the housing that's located there. Well, some potential impacts could be obviously severe damage or loss to property, right? Your housing infrastructure. And of course, the most important is housing provides shelter for people. So that impact of that coastal storm could be, again, loss of human life, as well as displacement as well for people. So now moving along into our scenario story, we're going to think about now, knowing the impact to our core recovery function, which is housing, what are some potential strategies to think about reducing that vulnerability to that impact? So a few that I'm suggesting here today could be, we would elevate our residential structures. Now, keep in mind, we are in a tidal coast environment. So we could elevate our residential structures well above the base flood elevation. We could also think about relocating housing in general. If it's too much of a vulnerable area, we might just need to relocate the housing. And this picture really does define to you just how high elevating a residential structure could be in a tidal coast environment. So what essentially, moving forward, what would be an obstacle to implementing that particular strategy? So what is the obstacle to implementing maybe housing relocation or housing elevation? Well, if I'm a homeowner, I may not be able to afford to elevate my home. That could certainly be, an obstruction to being able to implement that particular strategy. And also, if I'm thinking about relocating housing, well, if we're relocating one house, we're probably relocating many houses. So there may not be a lot of buy-in from the residents in that particular area. They may not support that idea for relocating efforts. So again, these are some potential obstacles that we might face in implementing this type of adaptation strategy. So now moving along in our scenario story, what are some potential solutions to, again, think about implementing our strategy, which is, again, elevating our structure or relocating? So essentially, we could think about providing grants, access to funding sources to make the elevation possible. We could also set up different types of community assistance types of centers, whether it be some type of intermunicipal or intergovernmental resource center, a one-stop shop that would provide information to homeowners about access to financial resources. It could be, information about insurance. It could be a various amount of just maybe education and outreach materials that would help educate or rather make folks aware of the different resources to relocate and find maybe access to housing if folks wanted to stay within that particular community, if the relocation strategy was the idea that we wanted to implement. So now we went through the climate stressor, the impact, the strategy, the obstacle, and then the potential solutions to implement the strategy. So that is kind of going through. Now, once you get to the end and you're at your solution, we're going to go back. It's an iterative analysis. We're going to go back to thinking about that impact of the coastal storm. So we're thinking about, we're thinking about housing. We're thinking about potential strategies for either relocating people or elevating the housing. What are the potential impacts of that particular adaptation strategy on another core recovery function? Now let's revisit those core recovery functions. We have health and social services, we have infrastructure, we have natural and cultural resources, we have economic. I'm going to talk about health and social services. So if we do elevate our housing, it could be 8 to 12 feet above the base flood elevation in some of these tidal coast environments, what might be the impact of that strategy on another core recovery function? And I'm going to talk about health and social services, in particular, emergency response. If we elevate our housing 8 to 12 feet above the base flood elevation, that could certainly pose an obstacle to our fire departments that may not have the appropriate ladder trucks to access that high of an elevation. So that is a potential impact to another core recovery function. If we wanted to do a deeper dive in housing itself, well, if we elevate our housing that high, that's also increasing the value of the housing, which is also increasing the tax assessment, which could be essentially impacting housing affordability. So that's another potential impact that you might see in another core recovery function, and that unintended consequence that we could see ripple throughout that decision-making process. And that's where climate or the scenario planning really can help us talk through some of these other unintended consequences. So now we just told the scenario story, and another benefit to this tool is that it's completely customizable and it can be transferred to other types of issues in a community. For example, if we wanted to kind of go into a deeper dive into that affordable housing thought of, you know, we elevate our housing and we have now added value, and now we have increased tax assessment, and we have now impacted housing affordability, you might want to do a deeper analysis of what are the equity considerations in our community for lack or access to affordable housing in a particular area. If we choose elevation of housing, that could impact the demographics in our community. So that could certainly be a deeper dive that we could do for equity and displacement. Another way that we could transfer this tool to other areas of planning practice could be the actual disturbance itself. In our particular climate scenario story, we talked about a coastal storm, but the disturbance could be something else. It could be man-made. For example, if you wanted to do an economic development analysis, if we have a small town, maybe the disturbance could be the potential that an employer in town is thinking about leaving. And now we have to think about how can we adapt to that situation? What are the ways that we can put forward some potential solutions? So the disturbance could be something other than a climate scenario. It could be something like I just mentioned, you know, an economic development scenario disturbance, a man-made disturbance itself. So there's a lot of transfer that this tool can be used in a lot of planning practices. And now I'm going to hand it off to my teammate, Mary Osterman.
Thank you. So thanks, Jamie and Liz, for introducing these concepts and demonstrating how they can apply to real life community planning situations. For the bulk of our remaining time together, we'd like to give you guys the chance to dive into scenario planning with an activity that we've developed. Before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about, our breakout housekeeping. So you're going to be working in breakout groups, and your group number is going to be important. We'll get to that in just a moment. As you approach this activity, do that from your current professional role. Call on your knowledge and experiences as either a municipal leader, a planner, a consultant, whatever mindset that brought you here with us today. Other than during this session, we're not going to keep any of the information that you all are generating during this activity, so have fun with this. Not that you wouldn't otherwise. And everyone's thoughts and suggestions are important. Please be sure that you're sharing the stage with your group members and respecting the thoughts of others. All of this information is anonymous. There's no place that we're asking for anyone's name or contact information. We're going to be using Google Sheets since we can't be together. We're going to talk through that sheet in a couple of moments. But before we do that, I want to highlight a few things about the sheet itself. We did use color coding. So we do have yellow boxes that indicate tips for using the sheet, gray boxes that indicate instructions and also have a suggested timing for each task. You'll see that in parentheses after each of the numbered tasks. Green boxes indicate where the responses are needed. For some of these responses, we did provide drop-down options to help with the flow and the timing, but we don't want you guys to feel constrained by those. You can always add your own text in the boxes where the drop downs are. You just manually type over that cell. For optimal functionality, it's suggested that once you're in your breakouts, you identify one person that will be editing your Google Sheet, and you'll all have screen sharing ability in your breakout. So once we're in there, if you guys want to pick that person be working in the sheet and share their screen with the rest of the group. And also the other thing to keep in mind that's important is at the bottom of the sheet, there are tabs. That's where your breakout room number becomes important. Your room number corresponds to your tab. We're going to go over this again and again and again because we want to make sure that we're being clear for you guys. Okay, some specifics about the actual sheet itself and the exercise. So what you'll be doing is selecting your community typology based on your group's shared experiences. So if we think about Jamie's case study that she just used, the typology was suburban and, in a tidal coastal area. You're then going to select your climate stressor, and you can do this using whatever your group is most familiar with. Again, for Jamie, that example was a coastal storm. So Jamie mentioned this idea of building scenarios. We've got a place on the spreadsheet for you to do that. You have the option to build 3 scenarios. This is one of those locations on the sheet that if you're feeling pressed for time, you might consider just doing 1 or 2 scenarios instead of the 3, because the ultimate goal is to get you through all of the tasks on the sheet. So the core recovery function that Jamie chose here was housing, and the impact was severely damaged houses. So once you get through that scenario building component, then what you do is select one of the scenarios and evaluate the impacts on the other systems. So as we just heard, we talked through health and social services as the secondary core function, and that associated impact related to response time for, or even ability of emergency services, whether or not, fire trucks may have the equipment needed for newly elevated structures. And then finally, you'll be thinking about your community's resilience if another climate stressor occurred at the same time or in rapid succession. So for example, you just went through a coastal storm and now you've got a heat wave. What do all of these things that we've just talked about look like? So now that we have talked through this activity, and I've given you a verbal overview of the spreadsheet, what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it back to Jamie. And Jamie's going to talk through the activity. And while she does that, Liz is going to show you the actual spreadsheet, and she's going to move her cursor over the cells where some of these responses go. So take it away, Jamie.
Great. Thank you, Mary. So again, this might seem like a lot. We want to make sure we're going to kind of beat you over the head with this scenario story. The Google Sheet is here to help you. Please don't be afraid of it, okay? It's just a way to help you go through each of the steps and just more of a kind of a linear fashion. So again, let's go through another story. I will verbally go through the story, and Liz is going to highlight each of the cells that is going to direct you to make your decisions as a group. Again, pick something that the group feels most comfortable with. So the next climate story that I'm going to talk about, and again, I like to reference a real event because it kind of conjures up some imagery, is the Tropical Storm Lee event, okay? So the type that, the development type that we're going to talk about is going to be a rural community. So think of a kind of a rural community with maybe a core downtown area, right? And the waterfront type that we're going to talk about is going to be that riverine. So we've got, a river running through a downtown in an otherwise very rural community. So those are, again, the typologies in step 1, as Mary has introduced. So now we're going to move into step 2, thinking about the Tropical Storm Lee stressor itself. That was an extreme precipitation event. So that is going to be our climate stressor, and that is step number 2. For step number 3, we're going to, again, think about that core recovery function, the impact that that extreme precipitation stressor is going to have on our rural riverine community. And I'm going to think specifically about the core recovery function of social and health services. And in that particular category, again, I'm going to talk about emergency response. And more than likely in a rural community, my fire hall is likely going to be located in that downtown area. So if there was an extreme precipitation event with Tropical Storm Lee, the floodwaters are likely going to come over the banks of that riverine community and flood the downtown. It's more than likely going to severely impact my fire hall that's located in that rural riverine community. So essentially, it's going to displace that critical infrastructure or that critical response. The impact will be floodwaters to that particular service in that community. So now that's your step 3. And as Mary had mentioned, this is only one scenario. Go through each of these steps, and if you have time, build out your second scenario, which is right below what we're talking about. But we want you to really kind of flush out this first scenario first. So our first scenario is, again, floodwaters impacting our critical facility. So moving on to our step 3, which is we are going to identify the strategy for, in this case, our flooded fire hall. So what we're going to do is we're going to potentially relocate our fire hall to a less vulnerable location. So it's relocating our critical facility, because it is a rural community and a riverine environment. And an obstacle obviously could be that, again, we just need to find the funding to do that. And a solution could be, again, we're gonna pull in and we're gonna leverage all sorts of, we're gonna braid funding at the local, state, federal level, because it is a critical facility. It is a fire hall. It serves, a particular function for our rural riverine community. So we are going to basically relocate our fire hall, finding some funding and using all of our partners to do so. For step 4, we're going to go back and we're going to revisit, So we're going to pick the scenario and we're going to think of the impact of that strategy and the implementation of it. So if we do, we're looking at the first scenario, if we do in fact relocate our fire hall to a less vulnerable location, what is, again, that unintended consequence of implementing that particular strategy? And we're going to focus on the economic core recovery, so that impact of relocating our critical facility. So if we locate our fire hall to a site that's farther from our downtown core, again, because we are a rural community, what are some of the potential impacts of doing that in our community? Well, if we choose a site that's farther from the community core, that can likely impact our response time. The response time can affect that fire insurance rating, which can impact the commercial and economic development of our downtown business owners, correct? Businesses could potentially pay higher annual property insurance premiums, which obviously increases the business's overhead cost with a downgraded fire service rating. So taking our fire hall and moving it away from our core could, again, have that ripple effect, and it could impact our business community. So again, that unintended consequence of a fairly, what we think would be a very good solution, right? We're going to relocate our fire hall to a less risky place so that it can serve its function. But we have to think about what could be the ripple effect that we feel in the community. So now moving on to step 5. These are just kind of what we like to call thought exercises. So for step 5, and I won't go into this with you here, but for step 5, we want you to essentially identify, again, that second, actually that's step 6. Step 5 is to consider the impacts of that scenario on the core recovery function, revisit and revise. So what are some key revisions that we can make in 5? And then for number 6, as Mary had mentioned in the earlier climate scenario, if we introduced a second stressor, maybe heat, another heat wave that comes through, how does that ripple throughout our community as well? So those are the 6 steps in our Google worksheet. And again, we really want you to kind of flesh out one scenario and use this Google Sheet as a guide and those preloaded cells, but you also have the ability to go in and add your own thoughts if you have something that we've not considered ourselves. Back to Mary.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. That was, hopefully folks think that was helpful to see how the content of the stories kind of flow with the activity in the spreadsheet. So before we send you on your way, there's just a few last minute reminders, and you probably want to know how do you access your sheet. So the first thing, when you guys get into your breakout groups, you're going to refer to a Linktree page in your browser. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But from that URL, at that Linktree URL, you're going to see options and you're going to select the range that includes your breakout number. This is how you're going to access your activity sheet. When we were originally planning this, we had huge numbers, and so we had to allow for different options to access a Google Sheet at the same time. So that's why I had to add this other additional layer. The other thing, once you're in that sheet, you're going to select the tab that corresponds to your breakout number. So you saw at the bottom of that sheet, the tabs were literally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So whatever your breakout room number is, that's the tab that you access. Thank you, Liz. And when you're in there, very quickly, someone needs to either be nominated or volunteer to be the person that is manipulating that sheet. That person will share their screen, and then the other folks can see what's happening. And also, you're going to want someone to be tracking your time. So if someone else can volunteer to be that person, that would be fantastic. And you're going to want to do this like within the first 30 seconds to a minute. I know it's always awkward when you jump into a breakout and you try to get acclimated and stuff, but trust me that you will want to reserve your time to actually have sufficient time to think through the thoughtful questions at the end where, you'll have some really good and rich discussion. A few other reminders. Jamie, Liz, and I will be jumping around through the breakouts, especially once you guys get in there, just to make sure that you guys have access to Google Spreadsheet, okay? And that you have your number tab. The other thing, when you guys are in there, use your professional hat that brought you here. So be thinking about, why you're here, what you can bring to this discussion, and that, whatever perspective you have, that's always valuable in this kind of process. So everyone's opinions are definitely worth hearing here. And it's part of what makes scenario planning successful. The other thing is scenario planning is really fluid and it allows you to be creative. So think big, have fun, and be super, super creative. So before I have them go to Linktree, Liz, Jamie, anything you want to add?
I'm all set.
Okay, so you guys see in the chat, there's a link or a URL to the Linktree. Go ahead and access that. We'll give you guys a couple seconds. Just click on that and keep that open as you're sent into your breakouts. And then I think we can go ahead and go.
Hey, Jamie. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, sorry. I'm jumping around to rooms, so.
Okay. Yeah, I just texted you guys to see if like you're able to do that. So I just wanted to make sure. So that's good.
Yeah, so far so good.
We lost a couple people like when you were explaining that there were breakout rooms. So that's a
I
little
knew it.
expected.
I said that to Liz and Mary. I was like, they're gonna, people, once they realize that they just can't like Zoom, what is it, zone out? I forgot the word. I was gonna say zoom out, zone
Yeah.
out. And that, yeah, they have to actually participate. They're like, yeah, I'm out.
No, yeah.
All right, I'm gonna see. And so far, people have the spreadsheet open, so so
Good.
far so good.
Good.
Jamie, there are people's names in number 8 and they're in there, but there's no one there. I can't hear you.
Did they like leave the session maybe?
I don't know. I wonder if they just walked
Weird.
away from their computers. Like, seriously, go there. I'm going to go there right now. Go. Okay, ready?
In room 8? This
Yeah.
is fun. Okay, ready?
Yeah, let's go. Oh, so Sam, if you admit that David, don't put him in 8.
Okay, yeah. Oh yeah, I'll admit him right now, but put him somewhere else.
Okay, so I got really nervous because I was like, oh my God, what if something is wrong? Oh, then the first group I had, they could not access the sheet and it wasn't a sheet problem. But at first I thought it was a sheet problem. So the anxiety I've had over this sheet. So it's like, oh no.
Let's see where Liz is. Liz is, she's in 4. So I'm sure group 6 is doing fine. We've got Molly and Pat in there. I originally came in with group 1. They had a little tough time getting started, but they're okay now. Group 8 is not participating at all.
No.
We should shut them down, kick them out.
Well, Liz was just asking how she gets back. Liz was just asking how she gets back to the main session. So I'm wondering if she's trying to come out too.
Yeah.
How are
you
your
have to,
people? How did the groups that you went into, did they access the sheet okay?
Yep. Yeah, they're going through it. So I don't see any problems.
Yeah, group 9, I think it just ended up that they probably just have less familiarity. So, oh, we're live streaming. So, I think there was also just like a technology glitch, like the first person that tried to share, like everything just froze right up. So once they switched people, I think that they got off, okay. Well,
Is Liz stuck? Can she not get out?
I don't know.
We want to tell people to start wrapping up at 1:15, right?
Well, the goal was to get them in there at 12:30, which we didn't do.
No.
We wanted to bring everybody back at about 1:10. So, and also knowing that we have way fewer people than we were thinking. I think if we leave them in there until 1:15, bring them back knowing that by the time we get everybody back and situated, it'll probably be about 1:20. And then we're
Okay.
just gonna have about 10 minutes to go through. And I think what we could do is just say, okay, we just have some overarching questions here to generate thought and feedback. So does anyone want to volunteer to share their experience in in their breakout and just see what people say? And then if we don't get anyone that's really biting, then, I can go through and ask some of the specific questions, but I don't, you know what I mean? Like, I'd rather have them work through the exercise than come and answer questions about the exercise that they didn't really get through.
Okay.
You know what I mean? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely going to get through just one scenario. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? They're not going to get through anything more than that. So, Liz is coming.
She's coming. Let's shut them down.
So they're all working. All of the rooms are doing, from what I could tell too, they've got the worksheet, they're going through it. So we don't need any of the other, supplementary information.
No, but I did give that first group I was in, I did give them the link to the Word document, the Word version with the questions. Because
Okay.
it really was, I think, just a lack of experience with something like Google Sheets. And so I did give them that option in case they were more comfortable with it.
Okay.
What is she, like, crawling to the main session or what? Okay, I see it. I'll be right there. Will you?
I could just grab her. Can I just move? I can move her.
Actually, we can. Should we? What if she's in mid-sentence, though? I got really nervous, though, before it was time to access the Google Sheets. Like, I haven't been nervous in a presentation in years.
Yeah.
But it was that fear of the unknown. Is it going to work?
It worked. The link
Yeah.
tree, the room. Yeah, everyone so far that I could tell.
Yeah, and I only mentioned that about the larger registration numbers because I didn't want them to think we were trying to make it more complex using this link tree thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Well, maybe she's not coming.
Should we just say we're coming up with a strategy for the next step?
She's so helpful.
She's in 5 now.
I'm going to broadcast message to all that they've got about 10 more minutes, even though they have a little bit more.
Yeah.
Did you get my message? No.
I see it. Yeah.
Oh, see, I don't.
You don't see it up on the top?
Mm-mm. Well, maybe I should go back to that one group that was struggling in the beginning. I don't want to
Which one
leave
was
them
that?
hanging. I don't think we need to talk to Liz about anything, do you?
No, I think we're good.
Okay.
So Liz is in 5, you're gonna go, 8 is not,
I'm going back to 9.
9, okay. All right.
Did you have any groups that were struggling?
I was in 1, 2, and 3, and I started off with room 1, and we just
Yeah.
had an issue with getting it like on the screen, like
Yeah.
just kind of kicking them off. But then when I got them going, I jumped into 2 and 3. They were fine.
Yeah.
I felt like I interrupted them. So,
Yeah, me too, in 7. Yeah.
yeah.
So if your groups are all doing well, I mean, I think I should be fine in 9. And I'll just check in with 7 to see if they need
Okay.
anything. But I felt the same way. I felt like they were talking through it and they were almost like, get out of here.
Right. Yeah. I
Yeah,
felt
which is great.
disruptive. Yeah. So good. All right. Well,
Okay.
I'll jump back. I'll do 1, 2, and 3. I'll just go back there
Okay.
and see. Okay.
Okay, bye.
Sounds good.
Hey, Liz.
We're Mary and Jamie back here for, I heard there was a group that was needing some help. Hey, Mary.
Yeah.
My group that needed help, they're like off and running.
Oh, good.
There, and it was almost like, we don't need you.
Oh, sweet. Okay. Yeah, I feel like people are getting it. Like
Yeah.
they're progressing. I just checked in on 2 groups and they're about to get down to step at least 5 and 6. I just
Mhm.
made sure everyone did one scenario only.
Well, the group that was struggling in the beginning, it was more of like getting the sheet on the screen kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
And so once they got it figured out, so I left them and went through the other groups. But when I just went back to them, they were finishing their second scenario and they're like, oh, are we going to get through it? I said, well, just don't worry about your third scenario and
Yeah.
do what you can for the last remaining activities. And, you know, it's not homework. You're not getting graded. You know, it's really
Yeah.
for your own knowledge and experience. Okay.
I'm going to jump in and check on my last room really quick. Are we going
I'm
to
gonna
pull
do
them
that
out
too.
at like maybe 1:12, 1:15?
I think we should give them
12.
till 1:15
Okay. I think so
because
too.
we have a lot smaller numbers. And so I think just having 15-ish minutes at the end to wrap up is good.
Okay.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
They didn't want me, Jamie.
I got to run into group 1. We've got a major issue. We have group 3 who is in number 1's seat, and so they're both in there, and they're like, "Why are our answers changing?" And I was like, "Because you're in the wrong tab." So I got to go to group 1 and say, "This is what's happening. This is why your answers are disappearing."
Oh my gosh. Well,
So I'll be right. I'll go let them know.
okay.
If it's fine. It's all good.
Sam, are you pulling everybody out? Or I don't even know if I know how to do that.
I can close it, yeah, whenever you guys are ready.
All right, why don't I do
Maybe an announcement first and then,
yeah, how can I do that now? There we go.
got it? Okay.
Yep.
My 3 groups, 4, 5, and 6 have made it all the way through.
My one group made it through and they were on their second go around,
Yay.
right? My other group, because my one group
Is everyone being pulled back in now?
about a minute, probably 30 seconds now, Sam, right?
Yep.
Mary, I can share my screen again and just pull up the,
Okay.
or when we're ready, I'll share my screen.
And Sam, I think we're probably okay just letting people keep the ability to mute or unmute themselves. It's not a huge group. You guys okay with that?
Yeah.
Because we can always mute them if we have to. Why are you laughing?
That's a funny comment.
You should have heard Jamie's comment about one of our groups. But everyone else did because we're live streaming.
We can edit this
I
part.
Sam, will you let us know, how will we know when everyone's back?
I didn't close it yet, but if you want me to, I can.
Yeah, let's.
I think we can close it, yeah.
Okay. All right, they're gonna close in a couple seconds.
Thank you.
I love the warriors that hang on to the last second to get that very last thought in there. You know it?
Here we go.
It's usually me. No, not yet.
Okay. It looks like we're all pretty much back. I'll go ahead and share my screen for the last time.
Okay. All right, welcome back, everybody. So thanks for sticking this out with us and working through that exercise. We only have a few minutes, about 10 minutes left with you guys. And really what we wanted to do is kind of get feedback to see if folks wanted to share their experience in their group or talk about a little bit about how their discussions went. Do you have any volunteers that want to share?
And everyone should be able to unmute and just talk,
A good point.
or feel free to use the chat.
Or the chat is fine too. Okay, hearing nothing. Just curious if these concepts are something that either folks are already working on, or if this is something that is new to them that they think has some application in their work life.
So this is Andy Rouse. I'll jump in. You know, the worksheet is great. The challenge with, I think, the worksheet is there's so many scenarios in real life and it's hard to capture it all in the worksheet. You know, like we were talking about how a flooding situation on a riverine system may impact a community that has an economy based heavily in tourism. And we started thinking about things like, well, okay, how do we get the water out of the, say, Main Street area as quick as possible? And what infrastructure may be required to deal with that. But then we also started talking about how do we provide more flood resistant structures or adaptations to structures so that, you know, a business owner maybe doesn't have as much of a loss if a flood does occur with any frequency in the future. So we did talk about those types of scenarios, so a public and a private solution. You know, but one of the things that we were thinking about after the natural disaster was really the question of, like, let's talk about the pandemic we've all been going through. That would really be an interesting modeling exercise, scenario modeling exercise on a tourism-based economy. And we didn't get it. There just wasn't enough time to really get into both of those alternatives. But, you know, that I could see how this could become very helpful in getting people to think about how to address and think through some of these challenges that, you know, we're facing with more frequency, whether they be natural or man-made or, you know, health or whatever it may be. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. That's awesome feedback. And I love how you started off with things are too complex to put into a sheet, and they are. And that's part of why I love exercises like this, because I think it helps us to remember how complex these things are. But I also loved how, as you talked through that, there were still nuggets that you guys identified that were really helpful. And I like the comment about, you know, revisiting and thinking through a process like this in a tourism community, you know, under the pandemic and what that looks like. Does anybody else want to share thoughts from their group?
I had a quick thought, Molly Gaudioso. You know, I really liked the worksheet because I think sometimes when we get into, particularly as planners, starting to try to address some of these things, we think about the tools and the policies and stuff we have, but we don't always think about the down the line impacts in actual, you know, in implementation. I say that specifically as a consultant, right? You know, you have sort of this policy, but realistically, the context of the community, administration, enforcement capability, what might be the impact to agriculture, tourism. So I really like that exercise to kind of force you to think about that and the multiple other factors instead of sort of this single clean event that you might be creating, you know, in your head trying to react to.
Thank you.
I think it brings this kind of exercise brought into focus a lot of the equity issues facing rural communities. You know, there are only a couple of us, but we were working through it, and it's like, you know, most communities and towns and villages in New York don't even have the ability to even go through an exercise like this, much less prepare for and apply for grants to study these kind of issues. And so usually it's a reactive kind of approach to planning and project design. So being able to do the proactive thing kind of shows, oh, well, then there's like an extra step that a lot of the communities need to go through before they even get to the point of being able to figure out how resilient their, you know, tourism-based economy is to like a riverine flood or extreme precipitation, et cetera.
I'm just writing down something you said because proactive. I like the way you put it. The whole idea about rural communities, just the equity issues don't afford them the ability to be proactive, I think is a lot of us, probably a lot of us on this call and in this meeting recognize that and appreciate it. But the way that you phrased it was really nice.
Thank you. I have some practice in politics, so it helps.
We have just a couple minutes. I do want to ask about the technology and format that we did, but before that, is there any one last thought or something that people have about the actual process and the content?
I don't want to monopolize that, so I'll make it real quick. But one thing that came up when we were talking that I think is possible, the extent to the tool and the sophistication of the tools that you can use are obviously going to vary from community, and there are equity issues there. But the first thing that we start thinking of is actually inventorying and identifying your issue areas or potential vulnerability points, mapping and tracking infrastructure, maintenance impacts, et cetera. I think that's something that some communities overlook, particularly smaller communities, and that, if we had that information at the start, when that climate event happens, you have the ability, I think, to be able to say, oh, here's our trouble, our key top priority or trouble areas or things we need to react to. So that might be helpful. That kind of came out, I think, in our discussion.
That's a good point. Okay, all great feedback. I do want to just spend a couple of minutes just to get some feedback on how this process worked in a virtual format, how the technology worked. So as we mentioned, we'd love to have done this in person, but we couldn't this year. Did this translate well to you all? And if people can either, unmute and answer, you can thumbs up us, you can chat us. But we're just curious about virtual and then also using a spreadsheet like that, if you found that functional as well.
I honestly think it works better in this format because everyone can stare at the same screen and see exactly what someone is typing. Whereas when we're in person and on paper, I have my own notes, someone else has their own notes. And so sometimes there's some overlap. So maybe there's a combination of a hybrid approach where you do something like this.
I thought it worked well, actually, particularly with a small group, because you could just see, well, we didn't show our faces, but you could hear each other person and, one person typed in the stuff and, you wanted to change it, you could pipe up and change it.
The fact that you gave us, that you walked us through it a couple of times helped a lot.
And including drop downs.
That up. So sorry, Pat.
Nope.
I think it was Amanda. So you guys didn't feel like we were preaching at you. I mean, if you did, tell us, because we don't want to do that. And we're hoping to do this again in the future. So any feedback on that, you felt like, if you felt like how many times we reviewed things before you actually went was sufficient, too much, or okay?
Well, the first time you went through, I went, oh, shoot, you picked the easy one, But then, doing a second one, I think helped just get it more into our heads about how to work it.
Okay. And Pat, you had something you were going to say.
I was going to say, I thought the drop downs were particularly effective and useful. It was a nice touch. So that way we didn't have to kind of wander through a universe of options.
How did you feel about the dependent drop downs, Pat?
You're speaking my language.
See, it took me a while to figure it out. Any other last minute thoughts on this? Okay. Anything, Liz or Jamie, that you guys want to add before we let everyone be free on a Friday afternoon? It's sunny here.
I think just thanks for being open to trying something new and working through this with us. It's the first time we've really run this out in a large group virtual setting. So we really appreciate that. And also, hopefully it's kind of like a tool that you can take with you. I mean, everyone now has access to that Google spreadsheet. So it's something that maybe you could use in the future or tweak to kind of really customize to meet your needs or explore other disturbances like Andy alluded to. So thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add on as well is that, we made mention to kind of, being proactive. And I know a lot of times when I work with municipalities, I always try to kind of reinforce that sometimes the solutions aren't always, the $1 million structural project, right? There's a lot of kind of non-structural, softer approaches that can be done that are kind of less costly. So even just kind of walking through this, at a board meeting could be very useful, right? If there's a particular issue that's going on, and being able to kind of just walk through it in small groups, if you're a municipality, and, a lot of times I know that there are these, scorecards or sheets that are available to help with kind of making decisions. Consider this another tool in your toolbox, and kind of walk through it, with your groups, with your colleagues. And it's really kind of a low cost way to kind of talk about some of these issues. And I personally would love, I think if we have our contact information, let us know how, I would love to hear your stories that came out of your group work. If you could just, contact one of us and let us kind of know the story that you came up in your climate scenario story, A, and then B, I would love to know as well how you could apply this to other types of disturbances in your community. That would be really interesting to know as well.
Are our slides going to be available somewhere after this? Liz and Jamie, do you know?
Yes, they'll be posted on the conference Eventbrite page.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to provide one last thank you to our speakers and facilitators. Sounds like everything went really well today. And I believe this is the last session of this year's conference. So I hope everyone had really had a good experience with this year's conference, and just wanted to mention that next year the conference will be held out in Buffalo, October 12th through the 14th, and hopefully looking forward to seeing everyone in person. So I hope everyone enjoyed today's session and have a great weekend. Thank you.
Take care. See you in Buffalo.
Bye, everyone. Thank you again.
Yes, thank
And
you.
just really quickly, there was one question. I just want to hit on it before we close out. I think Carol asked if we had access to the climate scenario spreadsheet. If you use that Linktree link that's up in the chat, and I can repaste it now, I think I'm technologically savvy enough. That will take you to, you can click any of the buttons, honestly, on that,
Yes.
and that will bring you to a Google spreadsheet.
Yeah, and so download that. Because that link won't be there forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Grab it now while it's available.
Grab it while it's hot. You won't, you'll burn yourself.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye, ladies.